We want to now look at the goods market model in an open economy. So we're going to go back to our first model, the goods market model from chapter 3, and now count for openness index analysis. So we want to look at the goods market model in an open economy. Now, the simplest way to incorporate international trade in our models is to consider a two-country model where we consider trade between a home country, the country whose economy we are interested in, and the foreign country, which is the rest of the world, everywhere else. So we're going to look at it as a two-country model. One is our home country, which we are interested in. The other is a foreign country, which is everywhere else, the rest of the world. So for this, we first need to distinguish between domestic demand for goods versus the demand for domestic goods. Now, in a closed economy, there is no need to distinguish between the two as they're the same thing. But now in an open economy, we need to distinguish between domestic demand for goods and demand for domestic goods. So if we start off talking about domestic demand for goods, the domestic demand for goods includes total expenditure by domestic households, firms, and government, whether it's on domestically produced goods or foreign goods. So it's all the foreign or domestic goods demanded by domestic residents. So domestic demand for goods is the domestic demand for domestically produced goods or foreign goods. So it's all foreign or domestic goods demanded by domestic residents. So domestic demand for goods is given by C plus I plus G, because whenever we talk about C, it is the total consumption by domestic households, whether on domestically produced goods or foreign goods. I is the total expenditure by domestic private firms, whether on domestically produced goods or foreign goods. G is the total expenditure by the domestic government, whether on domestically produced goods or foreign goods. Whenever we talk about CI and G, they don't discriminate where a good is produced. They include the expenditure, whether on domestically produced goods or foreign goods. So domestic demand for goods is foreign or domestic goods demanded by domestic residents, and it's given as C plus I plus G. But whenever we talk about C, I, and G, they have some demand by domestic residents that go on domestic goods and some that go on foreign goods. So now, how is this different for demand for domestic goods? Like we said, domestic demand for goods are domestic or foreign goods demanded by domestic residents. Now, the demand for domestic goods includes total expenditure on domestically produced goods, whether by domestic or foreign individuals. So this is all domestic goods that are bought by domestic or foreign residents. So the distinction between them is that when we talk about domestic demand for goods, so this is foreign or domestic goods demanded by domestic residents, but demand for domestic goods is domestic goods bought by domestic or foreign residents, right? So just to reiterate again, domestic demand for goods are domestic or foreign goods bought by domestic residents, while demand for domestic goods are domestic goods bought by domestic or foreign residents. So now to find demand for domestic goods, we make two adjustments to the domestic demand for goods. We know domestic demand for goods is just simply C plus I plus G, where we know C, I, and G don't discriminate where the good is produced. So the first thing we need to do is to go to find demand for domestic goods. We must first subtract imports, as imports represent domestic demand for foreign goods rather than domestic goods. Now, like we said, the reason we subtract imports is because C, I, and G have expenditure on domestic goods and as well as expenditure on foreign goods. So if you go back. So here we can see that C, we said, is total consumption by domestic households, whether on domestically produced goods or foreign goods. And similarly, I and G have a domestic component as well as a foreign component, right? So they include expenditure not just on domestic goods, but also foreign goods. So to find the demand for domestic goods, which is just expenditure on domestically produced goods, we first subtract the expenditure in C, I, and G that is on foreign goods, because that are not goods and services that are produced domestically. So what we do is to calculate demand for domestic goods, from domestic demand for goods, we subtract the parts of C, I, and G that constitute imports, because demand for domestic goods is essentially domestic goods bought by domestic or foreign residents. So in domestic demand for goods, we had domestic or foreign goods bought by domestic residents, so we subtracted the foreign part. For instance, a household buying a foreign good increases consumption but does not affect demand for domestic goods. So, subtracting of imports is necessary for the positive entry in consumption to not show up in demand for domestic goods. So, the first step is that if we have domestic demand for goods, so we subtract imports to take that part of CING that's spent upon foreign goods rather than domestic goods. We then need to also add exports to add the demand for domestic goods that come from foreigners, right? So we know that domestic demand for goods is just C plus I plus G, which includes expenditure by domestic households, domestic private firms, and domestic government, regardless of whether it's on domestically produced goods or foreign goods. So if you want to find the demand for domestic goods, so we need to subtract that the expenditure on foreign produced goods that is in CING, because we're only interested in domestic goods that are bought by domestic or foreign residents. And then we need to add that expenditure in domestic goods by foreign residents, which is exports. So demand for domestic goods is given by domestic demand for goods, C plus I plus G, plus exports, because through exports, we're adding the demand for domestic goods coming from foreigners. And we need to subtract the value of imports in terms of domestic goods, for which we divide by the rate exchange rate. And the reason we subtract imports is because you want to remove that part of CING that's spent upon foreign goods, because we're only interested in domestic goods bought by domestic residents or foreign residents, right? So the subtracting of imports ensures that we're only accounting for that part of CING, which is bought by which is that part of CIG which is spent upon domestic goods by domestic residents. And the reason behind adding exports is to add domestic goods that are bought by foreigners. Because, like we said, the demand for domestic goods is domestic or foreign goods. Sorry, a demand for domestic goods is domestic goods bought by domestic residents or foreigners. So, to account for the domestic goods bought by foreigners, we add exports to CING. And to remove that part of CING, which is spent upon imports, we subtract the value of imports in terms of domestic goods. As this will ensure that we're only counting for those that expenditure by domestic residents, which is on domestic goods and not foreign goods.